Okay. Good afternoon, folks, and we're going to have Ken Dolstead introduce our speaker today, Roald Lund. Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. I hope so. Good. Well, good afternoon. And, I want to say, first off, we're very honored today to have as our speaker, Dr. Roald Lund. Roald was raised on a farm in eastern Barnes County. Did I get that right? Or are you in Western Cass?
I was actually born in Fargo, North Dakota, but I was raised in Trail County, Richland County, and I had high school in Barnes County.
Okay. He graduated from NDSU School of Agriculture and also received his master's degree there, studying agronomy and agriculture education. He served in the U.S. Army, and after discharge, he returned to NDSU to become a professor of agronomy and did plant breeding in the area of wheat and oats. He subsequently received his doctorate degree from Purdue University studying corn genetics. He returned to NDSU to teach agronomy and was subsequently named Assistant Dean of Agriculture and Assistant Director of the State Experiment Station. After, about 10 years, I believe, he was then subsequently appointed Dean of the School of Agriculture at NDSU and Director of the Experiment Station. During his term there, both entities really expanded their activities and their growth in students and contacts. He then retired from acting as dean and returned to teaching, and he did a lot of research in potato industry in North Dakota. Roald has also been a longtime board member of an organization called the North Dakota Rural Rehabilitation Corporation. It's a nonprofit corporation that was established during the Roosevelt administration to promote rehabilitation in rural North Dakota. Similar organizations were developed in other states. In North Dakota, our primary purpose is to give loans to farmers and ranchers who are unable to obtain financing from conventional lenders. Roald has been a very wise and thoughtful presence always on that board, and he's always appreciated. He's always been a learner in his lifetime. He's always talking about books that he's reading and shares with us. And he's always been a teacher, and I know you will enjoy learning from the words that he's going to share today. Welcome again, Roland, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really do appreciate that, because we're all part of the history, and you commented on the history of 1934 when Franklin Roosevelt passed the Reconstruction Act of 1934. He gave to every state $1 million to help farmers out of the Depression. They could buy food and cattle and seed corn and all these other things. And so we have a long history of being involved with the government. And you might wonder why your grandparents, and great-grandparents came to America. Nearly all of your great-grandparents were born probably before the Civil War or near the Civil War times. But in 1862, Abraham Lincoln passed 4 laws that really impacted the ability of the immigrants to come to America. The Homestead Act, which gave anybody, believe it or not, 18 years and older, 160 acres of land. Can you imagine us giving the immigrants today 160 acres of land? Anyway, he passed the Railroad Transportation Act and the USDA. All of these things were passed in 1862. They all had an impact on the ability of the immigrant to move and come to the United States. The long and the short of it is things weren't very good in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden either about these times. Because of their inheritance laws, these people, the young men and women, the land was divided up among the families, so the plots of land became so small that nobody could survive. So they wound up being what they call husmen. They lived on a large farm, or they became cotters, and they lived on a large plantation near the fjords and worked for the master, you might say, the owner of that facility. Three of my four Norwegian grandparents, three of the four Norwegian grandparents all were husmen or cotters. The only one that was not was Anders. He was a landowner. But the others worked as harness makers and tent sail. They have to do with fishing nets. They worked for Amundsen. He was a major shipper, shall we say, and packer of fish. And the other farmer, the other grandfather was a husman that worked near Sarpsborg, Norway. Anyway, all of these things forced these people to leave Norway on their side, and they found a welcoming community here in America because of these laws that were very positive towards immigration and settlement in an expanding country. All right, now you folks have been through a lot of your discussions about the early farming, the early yields. Remember, they were nearly all organic farmers. They didn't have any weeds because the sod, when they broke the sod, they used a sod buster. If you ever look at a early pioneer plow, you'll discover it has long, narrow mole boards that pick the sod up, turn it upside down, and lay it down next to the other piece side by side. So you wind up on one side of the plow, you have prairie. On the other side of the plow, you have black or brown soil exposed. The farmers would then either broadcast by hand, or they would use a primitive grain drill, and then they would use a harrow. Now, that's my dad walked behind a harrow. These harrows were absolutely unbelievable. We still had one on our farm at Christine. They were made out of wood. They were called Boss harrows, and they were made out of wood, and they had railroad type spikes driven through the wood, and they would pull by the horses, and they would use them then to make sure the seed was covered. My grandfather actually had a hand scythe that had a cradle on it. So my father had in his barn or sheds tools that a pharaoh in Egypt would recognize. And the yields were good because there was no weeds in the prairie. It was all bare soil. Interestingly enough, they nearly always planted wheat. And wheat bushels here around Fargo, according to the early reports, were 30 to 40 bushels an acre. And the next year it was to what they call backset. Hawken would talk about, my dad would talk about backsetting, where they would go back over the field, the plow it the same direction, but they would add another inch of soil to the furrow. So again, you turned up a black surface, and they would either seed that to flax or to wheat. And that was some of NDS early research on that. So my dad often talked about, and my aunts and uncles talked about walking the fields, pulling mustard by hand. And of course, you guys, you all remember in the 50s, the tremendous problem we had with wild oats and all of those things. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Hiram Jockey was able to recognize all of these things because he followed, in his day of the bonanza, followed the railroad in order to one of the Railroad and Transportation Act of 1862 gave the railroads every other section of land for 20 miles either side of the railroad. So these had these tremendous land holdings by the railroad, and people like Dalrymple and Grandin and others came in, and they collected these sections of land and bought land between them. So they had these bonanza farms. Through Hiram's entire books, you'll always find he talks about get big or get out. and he was often criticized for that. But of course, the Bonanza farms fell victim to the costs of labor and taxes and all the rest of it. And then we went into the current period of time now. We've been excited about the new agriculture, the articulated tractors, the herbicides and the fertilizers. And then during my career, we began to talk about genetically modified organisms. And so I invited my son, Adrian. He's a research scientist with Syngenta, to give you some remarks on what he sees some of the new agriculture production doing. And I'll respond to questions first, and then I'll put Adrian on.
So you want us to ask questions before you put Adrian on, is that right?
Well, we could either way. You're in charge.
Is he there now?
Yeah, Adrian's right here.
Why don't you go ahead, Adrian, and then we can ask both of you questions after he's through.
Sure.
This is Adrian. He's a PhD from Nebraska.
Yeah, I graduated at NDSU in 91 and got my PhD in plant physiology at University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And I started working for Monsanto in 1999 and 14 years with Monsanto, and then last 10 years with Syngenta, which is, you'd recognize as Golden Harvest, Northrop King, those are the brand names. But with Syngenta, there was a period of, basically now it's down to 3 companies: Corteva, which was Pioneer, Bayer, which is Monsanto, and Syngenta. And anyway, I work for Syngenta, plant physiologist. I started at the beginning of essentially the transgenic or the biotech boom in 1997. The first Roundup Ready soybeans varieties were created, in transgenic, stable transgenic corn was developed in actually at the facility in Mystic, Connecticut. A lot of people don't know that, but University of Connecticut was the first university to describe hybrid corn. And the first stable transgenic corn was produced in Groton, Connecticut, in the basement of the Pfizer facility in Groton, Connecticut. So, but my background is measuring crops, and some of the things I think Dad mentioned that I thought were informative were the sort of the whistling past the graveyard that the early farmers did by using the organic matter that was present in the soils in the central United States and Central Plains, turning that sod over, release that organic matter, and the nitrogen. There's a process called N mineralization, and that's where the nitrogen is released from the organic matter. They essentially spent the nitrogen account from the soil for about 60 years, and then realized that they had to start putting it back and putting deposits into the bank. And around about 1970, 1975, along with the development of the Fritz Haber process, which takes natural gas and turns it into urea. Essentially, the Green Revolution, which Norman Borlaug with the dwarf wheats and so forth generated, but also artificial or synthetic fertilizers. That, and then of course organic farming, which is a process of using nitrogen fixing plants to regenerate that, to put that deposit back into the soil's nitrogen bank again. But that was really observed. Soil scientists, people that my dad hired, guys that we work with at NDSU, they understand the soil is a very sensitive organism, and it needs to be treated very with a lot of respect and a lot of care. And if you abuse it, it will bite you. And so I think that biotechnology has been a big advance in agriculture. The Roundup Ready and the BT. We've actually, as a funny story, one of the early problems was corn borer. So it was the insect that would go inside the ears and the stalk of a corn plant and weaken the stalk, and the corn would fall over. And we developed a transgenic product called BT. It's actually a protein from the Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria, but we put it into the corn. The corn became registered as a pesticide by the EPA because it's toxic to the insect. But the BT corn over the last 25 years has actually destroyed the population of corn borers in the US. You can grow non-transgenic corn now and actually get a good yield because the population has collapsed. And so there's actually a benefit to the benefit of biotech to organic farmers who don't want to use that. They're getting a benefit because we've basically destroyed the population of insects in the US. So that's been a big plus. I would add though, that I think the future is we have the same problem, and actually one of them is labor. The most expensive part about farming is hiring and finding people to do it. A big push in the Dakotas and in Minnesota is actually going and hiring people from other countries, young people like from South Africa. So there's a big pipeline of H-1B visas for worker visas from getting them to come from another country. The solution to that is going to be automation, and completely autonomous equipment is going to be in the next 50 years. There'll be one person and a fleet of machines, and they'll all be doing their job essentially unsupervised. And I think that's where it's going to go. And the number of farmers will continue to go down, but the number of acres will probably stay about the same, maybe go up a little bit. But autonomous equipment, my cousins, they're already if you're familiar with how they harvest, there's usually a crew, maybe four people. Usually it's a farmer, a hired guy, maybe 2 hired guys, and maybe 2 retired guys that drive in truck for them. And they have a grain cart that goes to the combine and unloads the combine into a grain cart and brings it back to the edge of the field to move it into a semi. Right now, it's very common that the grain cart has no driver in it. It has a home point where it meets the truck. It knows where the combines are, and the driver of a combine presses a button to call for the grain cart. The grain cart knows where the field has been harvested and where it hasn't been harvested, so it only drives in the harvested parts of the field. It heads right over to the combine. It gets alongside. When it meets up to the side of the combine, the driver of the combine takes over the controls of the tractor that's pulling the grain cart and positions it to fill it. And once it's filled, he lets it go. The driver clicks a button. The grain cart is now released to go back home. It goes back to its home spot and waits for the semi truck driver to get in and unload it into the semi. It's amazing, and it's not magic. It's every day. So.
And Paul, you'll notice when you read the last paragraph part of Hiram's book, he comments on this very thing. He comments on the automated grain cart. I'm just surprised. Yeah. The other thing I want Adrian to comment on is we hear a lot of talk today about artificial intelligence. In fact, there's a lot of negative comment about it. They said the same thing about the book when they made movable print for Gutenberg. That was a disaster, the evil's hand, and all of that. Same thing now about the artificial intelligence. But I commented about my aunties have commented that they grew up walking the fields pulling mustard plants. Mm-hmm. Comment on the AI and this artificial intelligence that makes the technology now that makes weeding possible.
Yeah, I think it's recognition. So if you have a phone, there's an app on your phone, and you can get it. It's called Picture This. And if anyone has gardeners and so forth, if you take your camera on your phone and you take a picture of any plant in your yard or garden or field, the roots, the bark of a tree, the flower, it will tell you exactly what that plant is with very high accuracy. That is a product of artificial intelligence and machine learning. It basically was taught, this is what a daisy looks like, this is what a daisy looks like, this is what a tulip looks like. And you do that enough, and pretty soon it recognizes that pattern. That technology is going to be very powerful in farming, because what to recognize the patterns using drones and satellites and ground-based sensors, will be able to say this field is dry, this field has Japanese beetles that need spray, this field has northern corn leaf blight, it needs a fungicide. All that will be remotely accessible, and essentially on an app on a farmer's phone. And he just basically says, yeah, I agree, and says, schedule the spray, schedule the water, schedule whatever. It's essentially, it'll be taking it down to the decision making is still going to be a human, but the input is going to come from a machine learned model. So it's going to be very exciting. So.
Are you waiting for questions, or do you have more you want to say?
No, I'm done.
We'll take
whatever
questions
you want.
now,
Yeah.
whatever.
Okay, let's open it up. Anybody want to raise the first question? Go ahead.
Yes, Jeff here. Do you think yields are going to go up, or what's the forward curve look like that for that measured over the midterm, let's say?
That's a great question. So there's an interesting experiment in by a researcher. To mute. There you go. Okay. Really interesting experiment done by a scientist named Don Duvik at Iowa State University in 2005. And he took corn plants from the 1930s and every decade since, and he grew them in an experiment where he planted them at basically very low population. So basically one plant per, 10 square feet, up to one plant per square foot. So 43,000 plants per acre down to 7,000 or 8,000 plants per acre. And when you do that, the corn varieties from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s all yield exactly the same as the most modern hybrids do. It's not per plant yield that is improving. What it is improving is the resistance to losing your yield at high population. So it's getting more plants for corn, it's getting more plants per acre in the field. That density, the population stress tolerance is really the trait that has been inferred as a yield improvement, but it's actually getting more plants per acre. That will eventually come to an end. We have maybe the average US yield is in the 190 bushel per acre. The record US corn yield ever possible is around 400. The theoretical max is 500 based on all the modeling shows us 500 bushels per acre for corn is the max it could ever get based on the amount of sunlight and oxygen or CO2 and water. So the 200 to 400 is really that gap to close. Mean yields will continue to climb, but max yield has probably been observed.
Do you think that CO2, increasing CO2 is going to make a difference in the world climate?
It will. Yeah, absolutely. Higher CO2s are going to increase productivity, but the offset is that moist water pattern changes where the loss of water is not going to help at all. So some areas, unfortunately, farming is a zero-sum game. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. Essentially farmers wish that they do good and their neighbors miss the rain. And that's just how it is. Everybody can't get a bumper crop and get good prices at the same time. So
can you, is it too early to ask the question about changes in temperature and how that's going to is affecting the change in the nature of crops being raised?
Well, I think, for instance, the tropical crops will begin to thrive. The crops that, like corn, is a tropical plant. Corn is a different carbon fixation cycle than wheat. So the cool season crops like wheat, the 100-degree temperatures in June really nailed. Even old Lars Jensen, when I was back working at NDSU in the early 60s, Lars Jensen said every day over 90 knocks a bushel or two off your wheat crop. And so we'll find, I think, the tropical plants will do better than the cold season plants. Brome grass will disappear completely. for instance.
Roald, can you articulate that in terms of actual change in acreage in North Dakota over time as to how they've changed the number of acres in wheat versus corn?
Well, that was more economic than temperature driven, I think.
It's yield, it's profitable. So the other funny thing is, it's not always about maximum yield. It's about maximum economic return on investment.
Exactly.
And so when crop prices are down, seed becomes very expensive per seed. Since the farmers are paying per seed, they'll actually lower their seeding rate, take a slight hit on their yield. They don't get their maximum yield. They maybe cut their nitrogen inputs, but they'll make the most dollar per. Maximum yield in a case where commodity prices are low is just handing money to Monsanto and to the co-op for fertilizer. It doesn't make you more money in your pocket. No.
Years ago in the Ag Econ department did a study on what it makes for profitable farming, and they still are doing it. Andy Swenson was the manager of that. They found that the farmers that used old equipment, that a farm shed, were the ones that were going to be more successful than those that were, say, plungers and bought all the high price equipment. Now that may not be true anymore, but at that particular time, to have your cost per acre of equipment should not exceed $200 an acre. Now, I don't know what the limit is today. I expect it's higher than that because I'm sure some farmers must have several $1,000s per acre. But back in those good old days, it had to do with your equipment investment. And like Adrian said, it's the bottom line. Right here in Minnesota, my next door neighbor drives an old tractor. He's got an old red combine. He probably makes more money per acre than the guy that farms over in the Red River Valley per acre.
But they limit out on acreage. So
Yeah.
that's the key, is that
Exactly.
you can't do 4,000 or 5,000 acres. The purpose of the giant equipment and the big seeders is to get it done in a short time window, not necessarily go forever. So their harvests are done in days. Their planting are done in days. They want that early window and they want to be out of the field right away. That's
Chuck, I think Chuck Gilgee has a question. Do you have a question, Chuck?
Yeah, I had a question. Thinking of the immigrants, and they arrive at some rural area, say Roulette, North Dakota, and they have this small farm. How do they? Well, first of all, how do they know what to plant? And what did they plant? Say back in 1890, and did they get the seed from on the train? Come out of Minneapolis with the seed? How did they know what to do?
They were luckier than hell because most of them had double bottoms in their trunks. In there, they had Arnofta Durham and they had early wheat varieties, red turkey red, and a few other early varieties from their home country. They happened to have moved from a northern climate to another northern climate. We didn't have the trees, but we had the rocks and the water and the soil that they are familiar with at home, and almost the same temperatures. We're a little cooler than Norway. We've been to Norway several times, but the crops are the same. I toured Norway from Bergen all the way to Stavanger, and I saw barley, oats, wheat, durum, all the cool season crops. I didn't see much corn, hardly any soybeans, but they were very fortunate. They took with them the very varieties that grew here. You have to remember too, a lot of the land went for feed, hay, oats for their animals. But they took their seeds with them. Most of those seeds were introduced from Europe.
Candace, do you have a question? Candace, do you have one? Okay. Mike Oyseth, do you have a question? You're muted, Mike. Can unmute yourself.
Well, I don't have a question quite yet.
Okay,
Try to come up with one.
okay. Mark Harvey, do you have a question?
I've got another question, Paul.
Okay.
Yeah. What about, do you see a future for energy crops beyond ethanol?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So biomass, So there's an ethanol model right now the current ethanol model uses starch, which is basically sugar, polysaccharide sugar, as the feedstock for the yeast. There's actually pretty good models that use bacteria and yeast that consume the lignin and the cellulose and not the starch. If there's been a lot of work, and that would also be like the switchgrass or biomass based ethanol. Biomass based ethanol is actually could become a significant source of fuel, of ethanol fuel, if it was allowed to. I mean, it's not going to be cheap, and for me, I mean, the question is when the fossil fuels run out, we're going to have to do something. And then the question is, why wait until the last drop of oil is extracted from the earth? And I think that's what's going to happen. I mean, just realistically, it has to become so hard to get one more drop of oil out of the earth that people go and say, let's try something else. Let's try biomass. Let's try, ethanol from stover. There's so much corn stover left on a corn. I mean, some of it is needed for regenerating the soil, but there's so much biomass. So only 40% of the mass of a cornfield at harvest is grain. 60% of the mass is cellulose, and it's just sitting there. And eventually it rots, and the fungus eat it, and it goes back into the carbon cycle again. But
we're putting a lot of money in the old savings account.
Yeah, that is true. But I mean, it's actually, the funny thing is, the corn stalks today are so damn tough that they wear out the combines. In fact, you see the old days, the combines, the stalks, they wouldn't last in the spring. You've been where the fields, they have shelter belts planted with corn on the side to catch the snow, and that corn stands all winter long, and they can harvest it in the spring if the deer haven't eaten all the grain. But that never happened in the 70s and 80s. That corn would be laying down, and by the middle of winter it'd be completely flat. Now they have to put a special plate on the combine heads to push the stalks over so that the stalks don't damage the tires on the combine. And that's how tough the stalks are today. And anyway, there's a lot of, I think bioethanol it has a place, but it won't be there until gasoline hits $20 a gallon.
Question from somebody? I've got one. I'll hold mine, and does somebody else have a question? My question has to do with the change in the nature of the ownership of farms. We think of my grandparents had 4 or 5 or 6 kids that all went and bought their own 160 acres nearby, and that was the family farm. What's going to happen in future years with what's the nature of the ownership of the agriculture?
Well, I don't know.
The thing is that there's people that don't farm and have never farmed that own the land today. Most of the farmland is rental land, and foreign companies, people, foreign entities, businesses that use it as a profit, as a investment, right? It's going to be hard to pry those acres out of those investment funds and back into smallholder farms. Honestly, I think the future is rental. And other people, and people don't even know where it is, probably owning the land, to be honest.
It's already happened in some parts of the United States. I went to Purdue from 1962 to 1965. My wife was a home economics teacher, and she was in charge of the hot lunch program at Fowler, Indiana. 80% of the land in that area around Purdue, all the way to Fowler and Minneapolis up to Chicago, was all owned by people in Chicago. Over 40% of the kids in that Fowler High School was on assisted hot lunch meals because the farmers were basically poor's church mice. There were professors at Purdue that for 2% of the growth, they would manage the land for this company in Chicago. And the big growth, of course, was corn. So nearly the whole country was planted to corn. And so you can see if that's the model that's coming our way, Adrian is exactly right. The land will be owned, not as Thomas Jefferson had wished.
But the successful farmer will be, it's going to be a technology thing, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you can run Perl scripts and you can troubleshoot electronics and understand the equipment. One of the things that's happening is like the equipment, this freedom to fix or freedom to repair act that started in Nebraska. John Deere owns all, they have proprietary equipment, that electronics that you can't troubleshoot your tractor yourself. You have to be a dealer to have the software to get access to ask the combine knows what's wrong with itself. It'll only tell the technician who plugs in their John Deere computer into it. There's a lawsuit and a big court battle right now, what's called freedom to repair, I think, that will give people the right to buy that diagnostic equipment so that they can do those repairs themselves. Technology is going to be the key to successful farmers. Now, they may not own their land, but they're going to be able to, they're going to have to say, I've got the best technology. It's going to be like interviewing to farm. Young people are going to say, let me farm your land. And honestly, it's going to come from retiring farmers, maybe not getting their maximum profit, but actually looking for someone to hand their land over to farm it. The maximum profit for them will not be a young farmer. It's going to be an investment banker. So it's going to take them to give up some of that profit to guarantee a family farms continue.
Tell us about the change in the price of acreage. What's happening in North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the other areas right now in terms of price of land?
I'll tell you what, that's driven by safety nets that we never had. My dad, if you were to read the story about a postmarked courtship, I sent that to you by email. He was going to be married in June 19th, 1932. In April, the bank that had $400 in it of his was closed. Can you imagine a young man getting ready to get married and the bank closes and he had no cash at all? There were no safety nets. And Ken Dahlstedt and I work with a company that provides now safety nets. Interestingly enough, my dad was interested in the Farmers Union at that time. He farmed in Trail County, just west of Hillsboro. They still had enough rain. They had good crops. He raised potatoes, corn, oats, and hay. And he indicated that they loaded boxcars full of oats and screenings and hay to send to the farmers in California because they had it worse than he did in the Red River Valley. Can you imagine that? There were no safety nets at all until the CCC and the federal FSA and some of these farm organizations came into being with Franklin Roosevelt. And now today, anybody that is farming has what they call crop insurance. And all of a sudden, farming now is no longer the super risk that it was. And I think that is the biggest driver behind the raise in land prices is the guarantees that we now have that we never had in my entire career farming or working with farmers was now the safety nets.
Well, and
Talk here about grain. The two of the biggest relatives farmers of our relatives up in Rolette County are very big into cattle. What's changing there?
Again, the buyers are becoming more and more consolidated, just like the landowners.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with the industry, so.
But who owns our poultry processing in the United States?
Yeah, no, it's.
Who owns Tyson chickens?
Yeah, and it's funny because their labor is also their biggest challenge, right? So people that working in, I was in Wisconsin visiting a grower, one of our customers, and he ran a dairy, and all of his employees were illegal immigrants from Mexico. And he was a big, and he just said, if I don't have these people, I am out of business. And he's basically just said, I can't hire anyone else to do this work and work in my dairy. Otherwise it will shut down. And so that was his choice. And he's like, and he wasn't really super happy about it. I mean, he wished there was people he could hire, but there wasn't. And so that was his position he was in. And I don't know. I was going to say that the other issue that I think is driving land prices, and unfortunately, this is true for water as well. Humans' development is going to be a big impact. Good farmland is going to be turned into golf courses and developments and subdivisions. It's happening everywhere. And when people want water, like in Arizona and the Colorado River Valley, all of the agriculture will go away in Arizona before anybody stops moving in. So the humans will always take the water for drinking and bathing and flushing their toilets instead of agriculture. And that's when that happens in California, it's going to hurt a lot, because our productivity of the crops that are grown in California, when that water is used for human consumption instead of agriculture, it's going to cause a big problem in food supply.
That's right.
Wanda Hine. Wanda is the sister of one of the largest livestock farmers in Rolette County. Wanda, do you have any questions?
I think Adrian just touched on something that really keeps me up at night, and that's the situation of water. So I think that's a real concerning issue generally. Adrian, we're here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and my husband's just retired from the university. He's a entomologist, so topic of interest for us.
Yes,
Tom Elfin.
my Tom Elfon was my major professor at Nebraska over in, and I was at Mantor Hall, but then they moved over to the new Beetle Center. But yeah, I was, that was where my old stomping grounds there. So
Yeah, good.
yeah, water is a big deal, and I worry about. We actually developed it when I worked at Monsanto. We developed a transgenic corn called Drought Guard, and it uses a special protein that makes. It's called a chaperone protein, but it makes the other proteins in the plant happier during stress. And we would get equivalent yields under normal rainfall conditions and a significant improvement in yield under drought stress. Unfortunately, corn doesn't like to be. There's a big trade-off. Nobody wants to give up top-end yield for a conservative water approach in their corn. So that growers are reluctant to buy those hybrids because they might give up top end yield, hit the lottery with the rainfall.
Sure.
And so nobody wants to buy a cactus when you could have a Porsche, right? And that's the thing we face. There are crops, I think, that as water, as the rainfalls go down and the average rainfall in the aquifers, like in Nebraska, as those aquifers get harder and harder to reach, and the water availability, we're going to have to change the way that input model. When you've ever been in Western Kansas, I know some of you, if you ever traveled in Western Kansas, Garden City, Satana, Scott City, that area, those irrigators are 500 horsepower diesel engines pulling water from 600 feet down at 1,000 gallons a minute. That motor is running 24 hours a day all summer long. And the fuel bill, I was riding around with an irrigated farm. He has 20 of those running in his farm, and we got a half an inch of rain, and he basically just was giddy because he just made $20,000 in fuel savings in that one day by getting to shut off the irrigators for a day.
Wow.
So it's anyone thinks that water isn't free, it's not free.
Wanda, do you have a follow-up question?
Anything, Gary?
Yeah, I have a question. One of the things I grew up in near Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. But over my course of my career in Western Nebraska and here in Eastern Nebraska, I've looked at North Dakota as being a rather exemplary situation with respect to the growth of diversifying agriculture. But in the last 10 to 15 years, traveling through the area, I see a tremendous increase in the concentration of corn and soybeans throughout, particularly eastern North Dakota. And I don't see that, I guess, again, coming from a state like Nebraska, this may sound funny, but I don't see that as a real positive move for North Dakota, because in my estimation, ecologically, corn and soybean rotations are not particularly sustainable ecologically. So I guess I wonder what do you see as the okay.
Hi,
Sorry.
Chris.
Sorry. Yeah, that,
Oh, good. Where are you?
yeah, I'll tell you that the funny thing is that, what was the 100, there was 100 different crops grown in North Dakota in right now.
Yeah, we
Okay,
lead the
I'll go
nation
down
in
and
12
open
or
up the
14 of
door.
them.
So the
On
thing
TV.
is that it's very small. So, you have to get in close and look to see what the differences are. But I agree. One of the things that's coming back are sunflowers. We haven't seen sunflowers in a long time. That's starting to kind of come back. Corn and soy are driving a lot of it, and sugar beets, which is an unnecessary crop. I don't mean to offend any sugar beet farmers out there, but we could easily buy the sugar we want off the world market. And but it is an industry that is basically sustaining itself here. But anyway, your comment about that is diversity is really good. I know there's people that grow garlic, but
So I'll go down and open up the
edible
door.
beans and stuff. So anyway, I would agree. We need to keep diversity up. So
Other questions? Any more questions from either Gary or Wanda or others? Randy,
Yeah.
you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. You were talking about the plant identification and the weed identification. Are they looking at using that as an alternative to as many chemicals?
absolutely, yeah. In fact, and you'll see targeting species in. So I said for Syngenta, we're a big crop protection company. We manufacture the bulk of the chemicals that farmers apply. We're the biggest in the world, actually. Putting not harming the non-target insects and plants and targeting the target organisms is one of the biggest advantages going forward. Using drones, using imagery, using satellite imagery, using ground-based sensors. Not only does it save the farmer money because he doesn't spray everything everywhere, but rapid computer image analysis saying that's a weed and give it of your chemical and then say that's a plant, that's a plant, that's a plant, that's a milkweed. I don't want to kill the milkweed because they got butterflies in them, but that's a leafy spurge and it sprays that. That is the future state. Either through drone-based targeted sprays or sort of smart sprayers. I think that's going to absolutely be, and it's an economic driver is saving on the cost, the input costs on the chemicals. The ecological benefit is completely avoiding the non-target species and limiting the amount of material you have to use. So,
Follow-up question?
I have another question. It's with regard to the use of Roundup to dry crops. Can you speak to the need for that? It's as a non-farmer, it just seems odd.
Well, so glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, and it's actually, it's gotten a bad rap. It's first of all, it's a 30-year-old chemical, and it's been around for a long time. Glyphosate is it blocks a enzyme in a pathway that humans don't have. It's the synthesizing aromatic amino acids, but plants have it, and getting basically getting the reason that it's done is because the longer that a plant is growing actively, the more yield it's collecting. over time. If you can get it to grow right up to the point before you want to, harvest it and then kill it, that gives the farmer a benefit of having more time in the growing phase and less time in the sort of senescing or pre-harvest phase. It is its practice, and if it probably is more frequent now because of the cost of Roundup. The glyphosate went off patent in 2006, I think. And so now the generic glyphosate products are out there. And so it's got the use of that active ingredient went way up. But I will say, as an active ingredient, it's a very safe compound. It has what's called an LD50, which is the lethal dose that you'd have to consume to be toxic. Its LD50 is higher than salt, table salt. But I think it's gotten a bad rap. It's not of all the gauntlet of chemicals that farmers have access to, glyphosate is not the bad guy. It just sort of got picked on because it's so common.
Further questions, Randy? You want to follow up on that?
I won't touch it, no.
Okay. Carolyn, you haven't asked a question. Carolyn Martinetti from North Dakota. Anything, Carolyn?
I don't have anything. I learned a lot from this afternoon. It's been a great experience.
Thank you. Mike Oisteth, you have a question? I think you're on mute, Mike. Yeah, now you're okay.
No, I still have no.
No questions? Okay. All right. Thank you for listening. Let me raise a question with the two of you that I have wondered about the future of the small town that serves the agriculture area. It seems to me that if in fact we move to rental land, the owners of that rental land are not likely to live in that small town, are likely to live elsewhere. Isn't the real risk here in terms of the future of those number of small towns, including Roulette?
Well, in my experience, that I lived Nome when I was in high school, had 8 grades, all 4 in a full high school, a basketball team and a baseball team, a bank, an implement dealer, 2 grocery stores, a couple of repair shops, a movie theater, all of that. And all of a sudden, people began to go to the mall, the Wasted Acres and Fargo, and all those areas were all developed. People began to think that the big box stores was where they should go. However, recently now, things are happening. For instance, the old Nome School, 2 women, one from Kindred and one from Fort Ransom, got into the fiber mill business, and they now have made Nome a destination point. They have rooms, they have campground, they have a motel, they have a restaurant, they have Thirsty Thursdays, and all of a sudden, the small towns basically have a real opportunity to begin to become destination points. Perham, North Dakota, is a busy little downtown. Pelican Rapids, North Dakota, Minnesota, for instance, has the potential to become a Perham, but the city leaders are so backwards. They don't see some of these opportunities. So I kind of think that I really believe that the small town, the organic farmer, the specialty farmer will have a niche. I think they call it niche, but I think that's a viable opportunity. But it depends on the small town a lot and the people surrounding it.
The people, yeah. If they want, Amazon can kill it all.
That's right.
But they have to choose to not do Amazon.
Hey, I'm curious, just sort of curious. Do the 2 of you still own the family farm? Is it still in your family, or has it been sold off?
No, it's in the family. Daniel Lund has the family farm at Nome.
Okay.
My dad bought it in 1948 for $41 an acre from an insurance company that could no longer own land in North Dakota because of the laws. And he sold it to my on a contractor deed to my youngest brother for $500 an acre. Land around that farm now is going for $2,500 an acre.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? We're almost getting close to the end of the hour. Further questions from anybody? Ken, you have one?
Quick question. I don't know if you're familiar with this. You had mentioned California and agriculture in California. We're in California right now, and I was wondering, are there laws stipulating how much land has to go to agriculture? I was thinking about that here in the Monterey Bay area with the strawberry fields, and there, the houses are $1.5 million, 2 million. You'd think that the profit margin would be more in the houses, but they're not converting it in some areas. Is that regulated by law?
Yeah, I don't know the answer, but it is a beautiful area. In fact, the avocado groves and I spent a lot of time in Gilroy. Have you ever been to Gilroy, the garlic festival thing there? And Syngenta has a flower facility. We also have a research facility there in Gilroy for peppers and so forth. I hope that local people take control of their destiny. The American experiment is about local leadership, local control. Our township, we control the zoning of our township. We manage those interactions. And I think if people don't want bad things to happen, they need to get involved and be part of their government and change that model. So
if you ever go camping with your camper in Wisconsin, ask them that same question. They'll give you a different answer. Wisconsin is very, very active in preserving farmland.
Yeah. Chuck, do you have a question? Okay, all right. Anybody else? Anybody else here? Anybody want to sum up? Yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
Back again on the immigrants, and I'm interested in the harvest. How early on did the threshing machine show up in North Dakota?
Well, Dad, in 1928, Hawken and my dad bought an international IHC number 11 combine that had a 1020 gas engine on it and a 16-foot windrower and a pickup on his combine. So that replaced the steam thresher basically and the separator. He also had what they called a grain separator. Now, if you ever visit a Pioneer farm, and there's one over at Roald, you'll discover they had old wooden sided separators driven by horses on where they went around and around on a kind of a pinwheel that converted the rotation into a belt. And so that was, I know that my great-grandfather, my grandfather never had one of those. So I'm sure that from 1900 and on, they all had steam, what they call separators and steam tractors. But before 1900, I guess I really don't know for sure. You got to remember the reaper, the binder, was invented in about 1880 and was popular in the eastern United States. So I would predict the United States has probably never threshed their grain like the Egyptians did.
Well, if those of you that don't know, the word combine is actually the word combine, which puts together the reaper, essentially, which would cut and bundle the shocks of the grain and the threshing part of it together is the combined. That's where the word came from. So the first self-propelled combines that would cut, swath the grain and run them in, and then run it through a cylinder or a thresher in one machine. That was probably in the late 30s.
Massey Harris was one of the early self-propelled back in the 50s.
Yeah, in the late 40s, early 50s was really the beginning of the combine. Before that, it was swath it, pick up the shocks or the bundles in the field, bring them to a central area and run them through a threshing machine that was being driven by a steam
And then
powered
burn
engine.
the straw pile.
Yeah, and then burn this.
Our Charles, Chuck and I are brothers, and our two grandparents formed the Wolf Creek Threshing Company, and there were several others that were together. So the need was obvious fairly early for cooperation among them because they couldn't afford to own the threshing machine by themselves. Was that more common than, say, having these roving threshers would come to town and then you'd just send it to that?
You'll find that in that, the Hartwig and Emma story of the pioneers that came into Minnesota in 1880 and 1890. Hartwig, my grandfather, talks about the cooperation between all the farmers to do the harvesting and threshing. That was one thing that was really, excuse me, unique about the early pioneer farms, was a tremendous amount of personal interaction. If you read those two stories, you'll discover again and again that the personal interaction of farmer to farmer for equipment, harvesting, all of it was very, very important to their early success.
Thank you very much.
Something we don't have today.
Right. Okay, any further questions? Any further ones? This has been quite an hour, and I must say, Adrian, thank you for coming, and Roald, thank you for bringing your son with you today. That's been just a delight. Appreciate it very much. And Ken Dahlstead, thank you for taking the initiative to ask Roald to be part of us today. That was terrific. Thank you all, and you'll all be. Yes,
Are you going to be able to make those stories that he's spoken of
Yeah, I'll
available?
make them available. He sent them to me, and we'll send them to you. Thank you.
And I wanted to say thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Thank you.
We're happy to do it.
Yeah, we're happy to do it. You're a great audience. You
Good
really
audience.
are. And those were some really fun questions
Good
to respond
questions.
to. Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
And Paul, you've done a great job. I think that's a wonderful
Yeah,
idea.
you're a natural moderator here. This
Yeah.
has been
Television may come looking for you.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again. And by the way, Roald and Adrian too, welcome to be on the ones in coming months. We'll be happy to have you on. Make sure you get.
Thank you very much.
Get Adrian's email address to me there if you would. I'd appreciate that. Okay, we'll see
All
you
right.
again. Goodbye, everybody. See ya.
Bye, thank you.